This happened in the fall of 2025 while I was on a sales trip through a small town in Missouri. I had spent the entire day driving throughout the northwest region of the state, visiting more than 60 sales leads. By the time I returned to my hotel that evening, I was mentally exhausted. Even so, I still had work to finish, so I spent several hours on my laptop scheduling emails to send the following morning. The hotel was a normal mid-tier place. It was not a chain, but it also was not a budget motel. It had a Western log cabin aesthetic and felt surprisingly cozy. From the moment I checked in until the following morning, I never saw another guest on my floor. That detail becomes important later. I was staying on the third floor, which was also the top floor. Around 11:30 in the evening, I was sitting at the desk typing away when I heard activity in the hallway. There were footsteps, a door opening, and a few urgent voices. I did not think much of it. Hotels are noisy places, and guests come and go at all hours. About 15 minutes later, I decided to go downstairs to buy a bottle of water from the vending machine. As soon as I stepped into the hallway, I noticed a gurney positioned halfway inside a room 3 doors down. 2 EMTs stood in the doorway while a man who appeared to be in his 60s lay on the stretcher. I could not see his face, only part of his arm and torso. Assuming it was a routine medical emergency, such as a fall or illness, I chose not to stare and quietly returned to my room. 10 minutes later, I stepped back into the hallway to finally get my water. This time, the gurney was completely in the hallway. 1 EMT was performing aggressive chest compressions, while the other stared at a portable heart monitor. I heard the unmistakable continuous flatline tone. That was the moment I realized the man was either dying or had just died. The EMT monitoring the machine firmly instructed me to return to my room. So I did. When I stepped inside, the clock read 12:18 in the morning. Even after witnessing what had happened, my mind remained restless, and I continued working for another half hour before finally climbing into bed around 12:50. Only a few minutes later, I heard what sounded like 3 soft knocks on my hotel room door. They were not loud enough for me to be certain they were even knocks. I assumed it was the building settling or plumbing noises, so I ignored them. Less than a minute later, I heard the exact pattern again. 3 knocks, but louder. I got out of bed and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. As I stepped away from the door, preparing to return to my bed, I noticed the handle slowly depress, not violently, just enough to suggest someone was gently testing whether the door was locked. At that moment, a feeling came over me unlike anything I had ever experienced. I stared at the peephole, but could not bring myself to look through it. Instead, my attention shifted to the strip of light beneath the door. The light suddenly disappeared. It looked exactly as though someone or something was standing directly outside my room. The darkness remained for several seconds. Then the light returned. Immediately after, I heard a faint brushing sound against the outside of the door, almost like someone slowly dragging their fingers or the side of an arm across it. Then everything went silent. Despite legally carrying a firearm while traveling, I was frozen with fear. I had never experienced such an overwhelming dread before. I turned on one of the lamps and spent the next hour sitting awake in bed watching videos, hoping to distract myself. Eventually, I heard another noise in the hallway. A door opened. It sounded like it came from the same room where the EMTs had treated the man earlier. Then I heard someone quietly muttering to themselves. The words were too faint to understand. Feeling relieved that another guest was awake, I finally opened my door. A man was stepping out of that same room. He was not dressed like hotel staff or an EMT. Instead, he wore dark slacks and a white button-down shirt like someone traveling for business. He appeared to be in his mid-40s. The only thing that stood out to me was his eyes. They looked unusually sunken, as though he had not slept in months. Curiously, I stepped into the hallway and asked if he had been with the man taken away by the emergency services earlier. The man turned to face me. After a couple seconds of silence, he nodded. He then stated that there had been 3 knocks and that the 3rd time was when they answered. I was confused, so I asked what he meant. A small smile crossed his face before he calmly replied that they did not always leave immediately. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the stairwell. Needless to say, I got very little sleep that night. The following morning, around 8:30, exhausted and still trying to make sense of everything, I went downstairs to grab some coffee. I stopped at the front desk and asked the woman working there about the medical emergency that had just happened the night before. She looked genuinely confused and said she did not know what incident I was referring to. I explained that paramedics had taken a man out of the room 3 doors down from mine and had been performing chest compressions in the hallway. As I continued explaining, she seemed more interested, but informed me that the room I was describing had been vacant. According to her, the last registered guest had checked out the previous day, and that guest had checked in alone. She also mentioned that the hotel occupancy had been unusually low the past few weeks, and that only a handful of guests had been staying on my floor, all of them at the opposite end of the hallway. She then asked me to confirm that the room I was talking about was exactly 3 doors down from room 312. That was when everything suddenly connected in my mind. The incident happened 3 doors away. My room number was 312. The knocking had always come in groups of 3. And the mysterious man's first statement had been that there had been 3 knocks, and that the 3rd time was when they answered. It was one of the most unsettling moments of realization I have ever experienced. It felt as though I was standing in the middle of something that simply did not make sense. I spent countless hours trying to explain every part of what happened, even though the front desk employee insisted. Nobody matching that man's description was staying there. She had only started her shift that morning. Maybe she simply did not know who had been there overnight. Maybe someone forgot to tell her about the medical emergency. Maybe hotel policy prevented her from discussing it. Maybe the strange man was simply another guest who decided to play an incredibly cruel joke on me. Maybe the knocking had just been normal building noises. Or the handle never actually moved, and exhaustion, after a long day of driving and hours of staring at a computer screen, caused me to imagine it. Maybe the hallway light briefly dimmed because of an electrical issue. I even questioned whether the entire experience had been some unusually vivid dream brought on by stress and sleep deprivation. But no matter how many explanations I come up with, none of them account for every detail. What bothers me more than anything is how everything seemed connected by the number 3. For nearly 3 weeks afterward, I was not myself. My mood was different, and if anyone asked what was wrong, I simply blamed work stress and a few personal things. I was afraid that if I told anyone the truth, they would think I was losing my mind. Thankfully, as time passed, I was eventually able to move on for the most part, although I still do not like thinking about it for too long. I still travel frequently for work, and thankfully, nothing remotely similar has ever happened again. In fact, the morning after everything occurred, once I finished speaking with the front desk employee, I packed my things and left the hotel as quickly as I could. While checking out, nothing else unusual happened, and I even noticed several completely normal guests staying at the opposite end of my floor. Even so, ever since that trip, I have developed a strange habit whenever I check into a hotel. Almost without thinking, I immediately count how many doors separate my room from the stairwell and pay attention to any room numbers or locations involving the number 3. Although the knocking that night always came in patterns of 3, it only happened twice, and that is the one thing I still find myself strangely grateful for. Because if I ever hear a 3rd set of 3 knocks outside my hotel room door someday, I will not be sticking around long enough to find out what answers. This next story is a completely different kind of nightmare, involving a very real, very dangerous threat. This happened to my roommate Misty, but I was directly involved. All names except for mine have been changed. This happened literal hours before I wrote this. My roommate, who I will call Misty, had a boyfriend named Paul, whom I have met a couple of times. Every time I met him, he seemed like a very chill, respectable, and actually kind of sweet guy. He would roll blunts for me and Misty because neither of us knew how, and we would talk about video games we liked. However, a couple of weeks ago they broke up, and according to her, it did not end well, and she had to get a restraining order on him. Flash forward to 2 nights ago when I was playing a game on my laptop, and I got the most normal-sounding knock on my door. I said, "Come in," barely looking away from the screen when Misty slowly opened my door and said in a mumbled, quiet, and almost drunk-sounding voice, "Paul broke my window and threw my clothes inside. Can you help me?" I could barely make out what she said, and I paused my game, got up, and came closer to hear her clearly. She seemed like she had just woken up from a deep sleep after drinking a bit. She explained to me that her ex Paul smashed her window in and threw a bag of dirty clothes she left at his house. Mind you, she has one of those bunk beds that has a little office space underneath it instead of another bed, and it is right next to the window he smashed in. He knew exactly where she sleeps, so it was kind of scary to hear her tell me that. But I am a bigger guy and I know how to fight, and he is a skinny but kind of muscular man. But I was not afraid of him at all and just scared for her safety. So I reassured her that I would stay up and call the cops and make sure he was gone. After calling the cops, I stood out on the porch, scanning the parking lot in the neighborhood street. But I did not see anyone. However, I could not shake that creepy feeling of being watched. So I told her to stay inside. About 45 minutes went by, and no cops showed up. So I called the police department number to see if they were sending a car, and they said we were second on the call list, and that it was a busy night for them. While waiting for the cops, Misty was getting texts from Paul saying things like, "Wrong move, bitch, and I want my vape back," which she did not have and could not find. So we think he was lying about that. It took another 3 hours for a cop to arrive, and it was 3 in the morning by that point. But the cop was nice and took all the info we could give him. He said if he came back to give them a call, and that they would go to his address that they have on file because of the restraining order. Flash forward to yesterday just before I left for work, and I had a gut feeling he would try to come back before I got home, because I had to close at my job and it would be dark out. At about 10:48 in the evening, I got a text confirming my suspicion. The next bit of the story all happened to Misty as I was at work. At about 10:30, she left her room to go take some trash out, and when she looked back, she saw a dark figure walk into her room. Paul does have dark skin, but Misty is a little crazy, she will admit. And I do mean that with endearment, but she slightly brushed it off as her seeing things. But she still went and looked around the apartment for Paul, or anyone who should not be there, and could not find anyone. So, she just sat down in her room and scrolled on her phone for a bit, till she decided to get up and get some cleaning supplies from her closet. But when she opened the closet door, staring right at her was Paul with a blank expression. Misty said she went white with fear but kept her cool and talked to him like normal and asked what he wanted. In a dead cold voice he said, "I just want my vape back," while she frantically but calmly, as to not raise suspicion, sent me these texts. By some miracle, 45 seconds after that text exchange, my manager said I could go home early since it was slow. I bolted out of my job, called 911, and got on the bus. I told the operator everything that was happening, and by the time I got home, the police had already got him in cuffs. By then, Misty had left to go to a friend's house to chill out after that. But she told me everything that happened, and I was shook when she told me. When the cop asked me what happened, and when I got to her side, even his eyes widened, and even he was taken aback by the situation. He gave me another incident report and said, "He is definitely going to jail. I am happy my friend is okay," and shout out to her for being so calm and thinking on her feet, and shout out to my manager for letting me get off early. I still would have called 911 from work if I had to, but it was better for my anxiety to go home as that was unfolding. This third story, however, takes a much slower, much more persistent turn. It is about a stalker who kept finding me over several years across different social media platforms. I had just moved out of home and started university when this happened. I was 18 years old at the time and living on campus in a small apartment. It was my first time living away from my family. The apartment was not anything special. It had a tiny kitchen, a small couch squeezed into the living room area, and a single bed pushed against the wall. Definitely was not luxurious, but I had made it feel like home. It was my first taste of independence, and I loved having my own space. One night after a couple months of living there, I was sitting on the couch watching television when my phone buzzed on the coffee table in front of me. I looked down and saw that somebody had added me on Instagram. The username was not familiar to me, but that was not unusual. My account was public and random people would occasionally add me, so I ignored it and went back to watching television. Less than a minute later, my phone buzzed again. The account had requested to message me. I opened it and saw a simple greeting. I do not know who this person was, but I have never really been the type to ignore somebody trying to start a conversation so I responded with a greeting of my own. At first, the conversation seemed normal. He asked how I was, what I was doing, and we exchanged the usual small talk. After a few minutes, though, the questions started getting strange. He wanted to know whether I was single, what my dream man looked like, and eventually what I was wearing. I remember sighing in disbelief. For context, I am a gay guy, and that was openly mentioned in my Instagram bio. Because of that, random men occasionally messaged me asking weird or sexual questions. It was not exactly uncommon. So, while the conversation was making me uncomfortable, he was not really setting alarm bells off yet. Then he sent me a photo of himself and asked whether I found him attractive. I opened the image, and the guy looked to be in his late 20s or early 30s. He was heavily built with pale skin, messy brown hair, bright blue eyes, and patchy facial hair around his chin and upper lip. What stood out to me was not what he looked like. It was his expression. He was not smiling or posing. He was simply staring directly into the camera. I chose not to respond to the photo and instead closed the conversation. Almost immediately, another message came through. This time he repeatedly asked if I wanted to play truth or dare. I declined once, then declined again, but he continued pushing for me to agree. Around this time, my best mate Connor came over to my apartment. I showed him the messages and told him about the weird guy who would not stop asking me to play. Being two dumb 18-year-olds, curiosity got the better of us. Connor laughed and suggested we just play anyway. Looking back, I regret it now, but at the time, I was curious and already planning on blocking him. I figured we might as well have one moment of entertainment before ending the conversation. So I agreed to play. I asked the first question. Honestly, I do not even remember what it was. It was probably something stupid. He answered before taking his turn. He asked whether I wanted truth or dare, and I picked truth. As we watched the typing indicator appear, Connor and I joked about what he might ask. We expected something awkward or sexual, and at that point, we were still treating the whole thing like a joke. Then his response finally appeared. Instead of asking a normal truth question, he casually asked how I was finding life at university. Neither of us said anything. I looked at Connor, and Connor looked me. Then we both stared back at my phone. How did he know that? I never told him. I never mentioned attending university or living on campus. I had never met this guy before. That was the moment the entire conversation stopped feeling harmless. I originally came from a very small country town several hours away. If I had known this guy before university, I would have remembered him, but I did not. I had never seen him before in my life. Connor and I spent the next hour trying to figure out how he knew that information. The problem was that there was not an explanation. I had never posted about university. I had never posted about living on campus. There was nothing in my bio mentioning it, and I barely posted at all. In fact, my most recent upload at the time was just photos of my hometown before I moved away. The campus also was not particularly large. I regularly saw the same students every day, so if he had attended the university, I felt like I would have recognized him. At that point, I blocked the account. Connor and I spent the rest of the night trying to come up with explanations. For the next few months, it stayed in the back of my mind. Every now and then, one of us would bring it up, and we would try to solve it. Eventually, life moved on, and over time, I completely forgot about it until 2 years later. By then, I was 21 years old. I had moved out of the university accommodation and was living in a house with Connor and 2 other friends. One night, I was sitting in my room when my phone buzzed. It was another Instagram notification telling me someone had added me. The username did not look familiar. A second later, another notification appeared, telling me I had received a message request. Thinking it was somebody who probably followed my TikTok content, I opened it. Once again, it was just of my own. The second I pressed send, a photo appeared in my chat. I opened it and my stomach instantly dropped. It was him. The same pale skin, messy hair, blue eyes. There was absolutely no mistaking who it was.